On a quiet spring morning in 1927, the farming community of Bath Township, Michigan was shattered by an act of violence that remains the deadliest school massacre in U.S. history. In the early 1920s, this rural area had consolidated many of its one-room schoolhouses into a single modern school, raising local property taxes to fund the new building. Many residents were proud of the progress. The school housed 236 students from 1st through 12th grade, but a few bitterly resented the taxes and school board politics. No one could have imagined that these resentments would lead to an unparalleled tragedy on May 18, 1927. What unfolded that day was a meticulously planned bombing that killed dozens of children and adults, devastating the town of Bath. Let's now step back in time and examine how this disaster came to pass. Bath Township in the 1920s was a small, tight-knit farming community of only about 300. One of those residents was Andrew Philip Kehoe, a local farmer and handyman who served as a trustee on the Bath School Board and even as the board's treasurer. Kehoe was known around town as intelligent and mechanically gifted. He had studied electrical engineering in college and worked as an electrician, but also as an extremely frugal and temperamental man. Neighbors recalled that while he could be helpful and friendly at times, he was notoriously impatient with anyone who disagreed with him. In fact, Kehoe had a cruel streak. He once shot a neighbor's dog for trespassing on his land and even beat one of his horses to death out of frustration when it didn't perform as he wanted. These troubling incidents hinted at a capacity for violence beneath his outward persona. Kehoe's life by 1926 was filled with personal and financial pressures. At age 55, he lived on a farm with his wife, Nellie, but the farm was heavily mortgaged and finances were tight. The new school's property taxes were, in Kehoe's view, a substantial burden on his budget. He constantly fought to cut school expenses and lower taxes during board meetings. The school superintendent noted that Kehoe fought the expenditure of money for the most necessary equipment. In 1925, Kehoe had even been appointed as the township's temporary clerk, but when he lost the permanent position in the April 26 election, it was a bitter public defeat for him. Friends would later speculate that this rejection by the community was a breaking point, triggering Kehoe's desire for murderous revenge against his neighbors and the school they had built. By mid-1926, several events pushed Kehoe further into desperation. In June of that year, he was notified that the mortgage on his farm was going into foreclosure. An acquaintance recalled Kehoe muttering, "If it hadn't been for that $300 school tax, I might have paid off this mortgage." He squarely blamed the school taxes for his financial woes. When the mortgage holder mentioned foreclosure, Kehoe ominously replied, "If I can't live in that house, no one else will." At home, his wife Nellie was chronically ill, likely with tuberculosis, and had mounting hospital bills, adding to their debt. Kehoe began to seethe with a sense of persecution, nursing every grievance. Modern criminal psychologists might label him an injustice collector, someone who obsessively accumulates perceived slights until he feels forced to lash out. Indeed, as later investigations showed, around this time Kehoe virtually stopped working his farm and instead devoted himself to a chilling new project, plotting violent revenge against the community he felt had wronged him. In the latter half of 1926, Andrew Kehoe methodically prepared to destroy Bath Consolidated School and as many people inside as possible. He had unfettered access to the school building during summer breaks and even as a trusted handyman called in for repairs. According to one school board member, Kehoe was hired in November 1926 to fix the school's lighting system, which gave him ample opportunity to sneak explosives into the building and wire them out of sight. About that same time, Kehoe quietly began acquiring large quantities of explosives. He bought over a ton of pyritol, a World War I surplus explosive popular with farmers for clearing land, and also purchased dynamite in small lots from various stores so as not to arouse suspicion. Dynamite was a common tool on farms, and neighbors did hear occasional explosions on Kehoe's property, earning him a reputation as the dynamite farmer, but nobody realized he was stockpiling for a deadly purpose. In fact, some of the explosive material was later found to have been stolen from a road construction site, suggesting Kehoe went to great lengths to amass enough firepower. Kehoe's mechanical and electrical skills were put to work devising a massive bomb inside the school. Over the winter of 1926-27, he hid hundreds of pounds of dynamite and pyritol in the crawl spaces and false floors under the school's north wing. He strung wires, fuses, and even placed containers of gasoline with tubing, apparently intending for a spark to ignite fumes and create a fireball to engulf the building. He packed explosives inside sections of pipe and farm implements to disguise them in the basement ceiling. All of this was done in total secrecy. One nearby resident later recalled seeing odd nocturnal activity at the school, a man carrying objects in a vehicle parked late at night, but it was never reported to authorities. By the spring of 1927, Kehoe had also rigged his own farm with incendiary devices. He cut his wire fences and girdled his shade trees, stockpiled lumber and fuel in his outbuildings, and wired his house and barn with homemade firebombs. He even tied up his 2 horses inside the barn so they could not escape the coming blaze. This way, when he struck the school, he would simultaneously obliterate his home and livestock, leaving nothing behind. Perhaps most disturbingly, Kehoe made a plan to add himself to the final inferno. He loaded his Ford truck with crates of dynamite, sacks of shrapnel, and a rifle. He even bought new tires for the truck to ensure it could carry its deadly cargo without breaking down. All through early 1927, while neighbors saw him going about town on errands, Kehoe was in fact preparing for mass murder. By mid-May, his wife Nellie had come home from another hospital stay, and at some point in the next day or two, Kehoe killed her. He bludgeoned or shot Nellie, the exact method is unclear, and placed her lifeless body on a wheelbarrow behind the barn. When authorities later discovered her remains, they found the corpse charred beyond recognition, surrounded by a heap of burned household silverware and an empty cash box with ashes of banknotes inside. It appeared Kehoe wanted to destroy his family and finances as completely as possible. He also left one final, grim message at the farm. Wired to a fence was a hand-painted sign that read, "Criminals are made, not born," an eerie statement of his belief that society had driven him to this evil act. By the morning of Wednesday, May 18, 1927, Andrew Kehoe was ready to execute his plan. He had spent months covertly planning nearly 1,000 pounds of explosives under the school and rigging his farm to blow up. The children of Bath Consolidated School headed to class as usual that day, completely unaware of the danger beneath them. Kehoe himself appeared in town that morning, running last-minute errands with unnerving calm. At around 8:30 a.m., he was seen at the post office, casually mailing a package. One of his fellow school board trustees bumped into him and asked him to come over to the school to help with a minor problem. The school's basement boiler was acting up. Kehoe agreed and walked into the school for a brief moment to check the boiler, but witnesses later said he seemed very agitated and departed abruptly, muttering that he had to go. It was an odd encounter, but no one had any time to question it. Moments later, Bath would erupt in chaos. At approximately 8:45 a.m. on May 18, 1927, an explosion suddenly tore through Andrew Kehoe's farmhouse and barn, sending flames and debris into the sky. Neighbors a mile away felt the ground shake. The blast triggered fires that quickly consumed the wooden farm buildings, and smoke billowed for all to see. Startled farmers and townspeople rushed toward the Kehoe property, thinking it was just a terrible accident, perhaps a gasoline tank or an oil stove explosion, and fearing that the occupants might be trapped. Volunteers arrived to find the Kehoe home ablaze from multiple points. A few brave men crawled into the burning house searching for survivors, but found it empty. They managed to save some furniture before flames overtook the residence. In the corner of one room, a rescuer discovered crates of dynamite, an ominous sign that this fire was no accident. As the men dragged the explosives out of the house, Andrew Kehoe himself suddenly appeared in his yard, calmly climbing into his Ford truck. Seeing the bucket brigade of neighbors fighting the blaze, Kehoe paused to issue an odd warning. "Boys, you're my friends," he called out. "You better get out of here. You better go down to the school." With that, Kehoe drove off, leaving the bewildered volunteers behind at the burning farm. Only minutes later, at Bath Consolidated School just down the road, the real horror began. At roughly the same time as the farm blast, around 8:45 a.m., an enormous explosion ripped through the north wing of the school building. Andrew Kehoe had set an alarm clock detonator in the basement, and it triggered the cache of dynamite and pyrotol hidden under the school. The blast was devastating. Eyewitnesses said the entire north wing of the brick schoolhouse lifted off its foundation for an instant and then collapsed in a roar of dust, glass, and screams. Classrooms full of children were instantly obliterated, walls crumbled, the roof caved in, and within seconds half of the school lay in ruins. The explosion was so loud it was heard in Lansing, 10 miles away. Parents, teachers, and students who survived the initial blast were stunned, many deafened or wounded by debris. First grade teacher Bernice Sterling later said it felt like an earthquake. The air seemed to be full of children and flying desks and books. Children were tossed into the air by the force of the blast, some even blown out of the building entirely. Those who could scrambled to free themselves from the wreckage. One survivor described the scene as just as awful can be. Classmates crushed under heavy timbers, others horribly injured and dazed. Within minutes, frantic mothers and fathers from around the village began converging on the school, their faces white with fear. A local farmer who rushed to help said, "Mother after mother came running into the schoolyard demanding information about her child. On seeing a lifeless little form lying on the lawn, each mother would sob and collapse." The north wing of the school had been reduced to a jagged pile of bricks and beams. Panicked volunteers clawed through the debris with their bare hands, trying to reach the children pinned beneath. It was as if a war had struck their small community. The Bath schoolyard became a battlefield scene of dust, blood, and cries of agony. Despite the shock, the community responded with extraordinary courage. Within an hour, hundreds of people from Bath and nearby towns had arrived at the school to help. Parents, neighbors, and local laborers formed bucket brigades and human chains to remove the rubble. The few automobiles in the village were enlisted to ferry the injured to hospitals in Lansing. The Lansing Fire Department dispatched dozens of firefighters and their chief to assist. Telephone operators stayed at their switchboards, urgently summoning doctors, nurses, and ambulances from all over the region. The Bath Community Drugstore, run by Dr. J.A. Crum and his wife, were converted into a makeshift triage center to treat the wounded. Meanwhile, the bodies of those killed were carefully laid out at the town hall, which served as a temporary morgue. Rescuers worked feverishly, many with tears in their eyes, lifting plaster and mangled desks to find any children still alive beneath. Unbeknownst to the rescue workers, the horror was not over yet. At approximately 9:30 a.m., about half an hour after the first blast, Andrew Kehoe returned to the scene to deliver his final blow. He drove up in his Ford pickup and parked near the school's ruins, where the distraught superintendent, Emery Hike, was directing the rescue operations. Superintendent Hike knew Kehoe well. They'd often clashed over school budgets, but now Hike simply saw a fellow school board member arriving to help. Another man, retired farmer Nelson McFerrin approached the truck as well, thinking Kehoe might have brought additional supplies or might lend his vehicle to transport equipment. Hike reportedly asked Kehoe for help getting ropes and ladders to pull survivors out of the rubble. Kehoe nodded and said, "All right, I'll take you with me." It was then that Hike saw the strange, deranged grin on Kehoe's face and realized something was terribly wrong. "You know something about this, don't you?" Hike shouted in alarm. At that moment, Kehoe raised his Winchester rifle, aimed it at the back seat of his own truck, and fired into the pile of explosives and shrapnel he had packed there. The truck exploded into a blinding flash, erupting into a fireball of metal scraps, nails, and gasoline. The blast instantly killed Andrew Kehoe, obliterating his truck and spraying deadly shrapnel in all directions. Superintendent Emery Hike was killed instantly, as was Nelson McFerrin standing nearby. The explosion also struck down Cleo Clayton, an 8-year-old second-grade boy who had miraculously survived the first bombing and wandered out of the school building. Cleo was hit by a piece of flying shrapnel and killed in the schoolyard. Several other people were wounded by the truck bomb. The town postmaster, Glenn Smith, had one of his legs severed by the blast. Rescuers rushed to bind his wounds, but he died of his injuries before reaching the hospital. In an instant, the already tragic scene became even more chaotic. The second explosion left bystanders dead or bleeding on the ground, and it ignited parked cars nearby, setting their roofs on fire. Those who had survived the school bombing now had to endure yet another nightmare scenario. One eyewitness, Monty Ellsworth, saw Kehoe drive up just before the blast. He later recalled seeing Kehoe smiling with both rows of his teeth as he pulled in. After the carnage of the truck explosion, Ellsworth found Mrs. Eugene Hart, a local mother, sitting in shock on a nearby bank with the bodies of her 2 dead daughters at her side and her son Percy dying in her arms. It was a vision of pure devastation. Finally, by mid-morning, the explosions were over. The perpetrator, Andrew Kehoe, was dead by his own hand, and the Bath school lay in ruins. The stunned community now focused all efforts on rescue, recovery, and grieving for their lost. In the hours and days after the bombing, the small village of Bath was overwhelmed with sorrow, but also with support from across Michigan. Rescue workers and volunteers continued to sift through the wreckage of the school well into the night of May 18th and beyond, searching for any remaining survivors or the bodies of the victims. Remarkably, in the south wing of the school, which had not collapsed, investigators discovered an additional 500 pounds of unexploded dynamite rigged with a timer, bombs that Kehoe had set to go off at the same moment as the first explosion, but which for some reason failed to detonate. Had those explosives gone off as intended, the entirety of Bath Consolidated School would likely have been destroyed, and the death toll would have been even more horrific. The realization that Kehoe had intended to kill all 236 children and everyone at the school sent a further chill through survivors. In total, the Bath school disaster claimed the lives of 44 innocent people, 38 of them children, before counting Kehoe himself. Among the dead were 2 teachers and several local community members who had responded to the emergency, including Superintendent Emery Hike, Postmaster Glenn Smith, and Farmer Nelson McFerrin. Dozens more were wounded. At least 58 people were injured, many of them children who bore physical and emotional scars for life. The village of Bath was left reeling from the loss. In one heartbreaking detail, the town held a mass funeral where the tiny coffins of 34 children were arranged in a row, a nearly unbearable sight for any community. Virtually every family in the area was touched by the tragedy, either by loss of a child or knowing someone who lost loved ones. As the shock subsided, people searched for answers. Investigators picked through the debris at both the school and Kehoe's farm, piecing together the timeline and motive. At the Kehoe farm, they found Nellie Kehoe's charred remains in the wheelbarrow, confirming that Kehoe had murdered his wife before blowing up his house. They also noted how deliberately he had destroyed his property. The farm's machinery was smashed, and those 2 poor horses had been wired inside the barn to prevent their escape. The discovery of Kehoe's parting message, "Criminals are made, not born," nailed to the farm fence, was interpreted as his attempt to shift blame for his crimes onto the community or society at large. It was as if he wanted to send a final justification that they had driven him to madness. But Bath residents had little interest in Kehoe's self-serving logic. They were too consumed with mourning and rebuilding. The Bath school disaster made headlines nationwide. However, its notoriety was somewhat short-lived in 1927, overshadowed in the national press by Charles Lindbergh's famous transatlantic flight, which occurred just 2 days later. In the community of Bath, though, the memory of that dark day was never forgotten. The destroyed Bath Consolidated School was eventually torn down. With donations that poured in, a new school building was constructed on the same site by the next year. It was named the Senator James Couzens Agricultural School, and it opened in September 1928, symbolizing the community's determination to recover. The new school incorporated the cupola salvaged from the ruins of the old building as a memorial centerpiece, and classes resumed, though Bath would never be the same. In 1975, that replacement school was also demolished, but a memorial park stands there today with the original cupola and a plaque bearing the names of the victims. Each year, residents and descendants pause to remember the children, teachers, and neighbors who were lost. Nearly a century later, the Bath school bombing remains a sobering lesson in the destructive potential of one man's rage. It stands as the deadliest act of school violence in American history, a grim record that, despite more recent tragedies, has never been exceeded in terms of lives lost. In telling this story, we honor the resilience of the Bath community and the innocent lives taken on that spring morning in 1927. The Bath school disaster is a tragic chapter of history that reminds us how important it is to notice warning signs, address grievances peacefully, and above all, cherish and protect our communities and children. The events in Bath, Michigan in 1927 will forever be a testament to both unfathomable malice and the extraordinary strength of a community in the face of heartbreak. The legacy of the Bath school disaster lives on, etched in stone at the memorial site and in the hearts of those who remember the innocent victims of that fateful day.